All right, so we're back for our last session of the day here. We're going to talk a little bit about implementation readiness, must-dos before starting your transformation. And if you've already started your transformation, which I know a lot of you have, don't panic. It's still relevant to where you're at in your project. Another way to look at what we'll talk about here today and the framework we're going to go through is for each phase of a project you're in, how can we move forward some of the activities that oftentimes don't get put off, or oftentimes get put off until the end or too late in a project, and really just highlighting those activities that you may want to think about accelerating if you haven't already. If you're earlier in the project and you still have either your first phase yet to start or future phases yet to start, then you'll benefit from this and you'll be able to apply this framework as well. So you all know me by now, hopefully. We'll talk a bit about why implementation readiness is so important, talk a bit about an overview of readiness, and then talk a bit about the components of implementation readiness, as well as how to apply a QA framework prior to implementation. What I'm going to do in the interest of time is just cherry pick some of these slides here today. This is actually a pretty long or pretty lengthy deck. We can always unpack some of this tomorrow, time permitting as well, or if there's something you want to dive into offline, we can set up a one-on-one with your team and myself to talk through this in more detail. So hopefully this will be somewhat of a primer and get the wheels turning on some things to think about moving forward in your transformation readiness. So the problem that we see with a lot of companies out there is they pick D365 and they aren't quite sure what to do first. And one of the first instincts that companies often see is they pick the software, they've procured the software, hopefully they've followed a lot of the best practices that Marcus just talked about from a negotiation perspective, and there's a itching need to just start doing stuff. And add to the fact that your VAR system integrator is probably pressuring you to get started right away, sign the contract, let's not wait, let's start the implementation tomorrow, let's bring our team of D365 consultants on ASAP. There's that instinct combined with the pressure to get started right away on the technical implementation oftentimes leads to problems down the line, primarily in that, one of the big ones is just not having a clear vision or plan for how it is you want to deploy the technology, how it is you want to leverage your system integrator. And one of those hidden risks and challenges of just jumping straight into your deployment is that you end up delegating more of the transformation to your system integrator or VAR without having ownership of the project or adequate ownership of the project, and you end up oftentimes not addressing their deficiencies. So the system integrators and VARs typically are really good at what they do, but they typically have weaknesses that they aren't good at. Things like organizational change, data migration, some of the other things we'll talk about here tomorrow as well. And so you really want to have a clear vision and plan for how are we going to use our system integrator, how are we going to plug their gaps or address the gaps in what their competencies are. And what this also does is it creates unrealistic expectations when we just jump straight into our implementation. We get the feeling that we're going to speed things up by starting right away, but it's almost like building a house without a clear blueprint. If you just start building stuff, it's going to take you a lot longer and cost you a lot more money because you're going to be doing a lot of rework and you're not going to ever quite get it right unless you take that time up front to get the blueprint in place. So a lot of what we'll talk about today, I would use the analogy of having a blueprint for your overall transformation prior to bringing in all the subcontractors. In this case, your system integrator is one of the subcontractors you'd be leaning on, and potentially data migrations, outside support, any other third-party consulting, or any other help you might bring in. You want to have a clear vision and blueprint for how you want to move forward before you start building that house, so to speak. So when we look at transformations, there's really 4 dimensions of what enables a transformation. You have the process, technology, people, and business side of things. And your implementation partners, your D365, VAR, reseller, whoever it is you're working with on the technology side, is certainly important to the technical component or the technical piece, but it's usually the process, people, and business side of things that are the more complex areas that need more attention. So we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves and start down the technical path without having addressed the process, people, and business side of the equation first. And when we look at transformation complexity factors, what are the things that drive implementation time and cost, and some of those metrics that both Marcus and Ash talked about earlier today? Process change, people, and technology are the three that have the biggest impact on time and cost. But secondary to that, almost as important, is the functional scope of what you're implementing, geographic scope, the level of internal experience you might have with the technology or with transformations in general, as well as your overall timeline. So to shift gears then and address or talk about how do we address those challenges and those common pitfalls that we see with organizations out there that are implementing D365, I want to talk a little bit just about the overview of implementation readiness. And when we look at implementation readiness, we're looking at 5 major work streams or areas. And we're going to unpack this a little bit more one by one and more of a Gantt chart type of format with more specific work streams and sub work streams. But you have your strategic and executive alignment, which is back to the alignment point that we made in the first session today. How do we make sure that our corporate strategy and objectives is aligned with our project and vice versa? And how do we make sure we have the right level of support at the executive level? The operational readiness component is really, think of it as the business process side of things, making sure we have a clear vision for how we want our processes to work. And what I mean by that is not necessarily down at the workflow level of how are we going to configure D365, but at a higher level of defining overall, how is it that our processes should be working? What's our customer experience going to look like? What's our employee experience going to look like? What are the processes that support that? And define that high-level blueprint first so that when we bring in the system integrator or VAR, they can help us define the more specific D365 related workflows in the context of that overarching blueprint. And then we have the technical readiness, which includes data, which Daryl will talk about tomorrow morning, as well as reports and integration and applications and how everything's going to tie together. So that whole technical readiness component is another work stream that we recommend you start sooner than later. And then there's the people readiness or the organizational change component, as well as the project governance pieces of it. So those are the 5 major components of what we suggest being addressed ideally before you ever start bringing in your entire team of functional and technical system integrator or VAR D365 resources. But if you have already brought them on, it's never too late to get ahead of this and work to see, where can we cherry pick pieces of this framework to really get ahead of where the system integrator is, so that we're in a position where the business can drive the system integrator and the software more so than being a technology-driven initiative. So in terms of how we typically operate with our clients, just more of a side note, typically your internal team, first of all, should own this overall project. A lot of times companies think they can outsource the whole thing to a system integrator or even third stage. And it's not an ideal scenario long-term, because you really want to have ownership. You want to build the internal knowledge and competencies. You want to be the ones making decisions that are best for your business. You certainly want to lean on outside parties for advice and best practices and things of that nature. But it's your job to really interpret, okay, outside consultants have a unique view of the world. They bring value, but we ultimately have to live with these decisions longer term. So how are we going to leverage those outside resources? And then the system integrator off to the bottom right would typically provide that D365 functional and technical expertise. They have a number of other roles, but in general, their focus is on D365. And then typically when we're working with clients in this capacity, we're acting more as an extension of the clients or your internal core team, providing readiness support, QA throughout the entire implementation, organizational change support, as well as other non-technology project roles that are not specific to D365, but still very important to the overall transformation. So just to take it a step further then and look at what are some of the components of readiness. And again, this is ideally, these are some work streams that would start after this stuff here has been done, which is basically your entire digital strategy, your overall evaluation. This is the framework we use to help clients through the strategy and software selection phase. But let's assume you've already done that stuff, and I think most of you probably have. There might be bits and pieces here of stuff that you hadn't done as part of your selection, so you might think about, how could we accelerate some of these things or get started on some of these things before we get too far down into our implementation. But in a perfect world, these are things that would have been completed prior to the selection, prior to getting into that implementation readiness phase. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip a couple slides here, and we'll share these slides with you for reference as well as the recorded video, like I mentioned earlier. But this is those 5 work streams I mentioned before, just a couple slides back. This unpacks those a little bit more, but more in a sequential sub work stream type of format. And a lot of these things are running in parallel. It's obviously not an exact science as far as when some of these things need to happen, but in general, it gives you a sense of order of magnitude of the types of things that need to be happening within each of these work streams. And what I'll do is I have a slide for each of these 5 work streams, and that's really where I'll focus the remainder of the session here today. And what we don't get to, we can cover offline with you individually if you want to deep dive to any of this. The one thing I'll mention is kind of a context setting for when we're working with clients that are about to implement D365. Depending on the size of the company, this whole readiness phase could take anywhere from 2 to 6 months, roughly. I mean, for a smaller, more vanilla company with a more narrow scope, it might just be several weeks or a couple months of effort. For a larger global company that's deploying a pretty broad scope, going through pretty significant process changes along the way, this could be more like a several month type of time frame. But again, regardless of how long it takes, whether it's 2 or 6 or some other number of months, it's important not to think of this as incremental time added to the project. It's simply looking at when do these activities happen. These are all things that should happen either way. The question is, do you put it off until later in the project when you've theoretically gotten too far behind on some of these activities, or do you pull them forward because they're critical path activities? They're instrumental to the overall success of the project, and they really set the tone and set the business blueprint for the entire project. So that's really the question here, is not, it's usually not do we do this stuff, it's when do we do this stuff. And that's really the difference here with what we're talking about in this framework. So if you see here just the format, just so we'll take each of these 5 work streams listed on this slide. We take each one and dive into it a little bit more detail. So the first one is that strategic and an executive alignment. And this is really where we look at, what is our vision as a company, our strategy and objectives. We assume that, most companies we work with have this in their heads. Sometimes it's documented, sometimes it's not. We're not, I'd love to say that we have all the answers, but we don't. We don't know how to run your business, what the best strategy is for your business. We're not trying to be McKinsey or Bain or one of those strategy consulting firms. But what we do need to do is just understand the company's overall strategy and vision so we can translate that into specific objectives and parameters for this overall transformation. So some of the major work streams that happen within this area one is education. So, typically we'll educate executives on what to expect in these types of implementations, what some of the best practices are, lessons from other clients, and really just making sure we're all on the same page and understanding that, this is a great opportunity for us to go through this transformation, but it's not a silver bullet. It's not all rainbows and unicorns. There's going to be challenges and difficulties along the way, and just really having our eyes open to that there will be challenges. There'll be things that were unexpected, and the key is how do we work through that. I mentioned the strategy articulation. That's a key part of this. Also looking at who the stakeholders are, the key stakeholders that we need to make sure we have their buy-in and alignment, and we have a communication plan and a targeted communication plan to keep everyone in sync. As it relates to business decisions and operational alignment, that's another component, as well as executive communication, and then having a stage gate review and having the executives own the decision on whether or not or when to move into that full-blown implementation phase of the project. And so again, we're kind of think of this as starting at the top and working our way down the organization to make sure that the entire team is ready for the transformation and ready to make the best use of the resources that will be helping throughout the transformation. Then we get into operational readiness. This is where we look at our future state processes and define what is it we want to be when we grow up. We're not yet getting down into the detailed workflows of D365 and making configuration decisions, but we are defining as a business, how is it we want to operate. And there's some schools of thought that would say, well, we need to know what D365 can do in order to understand how we should run our business. that is somewhat true in certain cases. That can be true. That's certainly true at the transactional level in terms of how we do things. But the what we do, why we do it, all that is a more strategic decision that ultimately should be technology agnostic. I mean, there's certain things that all of you do as a business where it doesn't matter if you're using D365 or a pen and paper or Excel spreadsheets or whatever. There's certain things you're just going to do that are important to your business to provide a better customer experience or better track your inventory and products or whatever the case may be. So those are the types of decisions where we want the business to drive the software so that when we do get to configuration decisions, we're making it in the context of what we need the business to do. Now, typically with business processes, we'll segment or bifurcate the processes into two buckets. One bucket being those strategic processes that really are differentiators for us. It might involve our secret sauce, our customer-facing types of processes, things that anything related to the customer journey, customer experience, those might be examples of areas that are high priority strategic items where we're going to spend more time defining what we want those processes to look like so that those processes are driving how D365 gets deployed. And then there's another bucket of things that are more back office, or maybe they're not, it's not that they're not important, but they aren't differentiators or competitive advantages for you as an organization. Those might be ones where we just have a very high level view of what we want the technology to do, but we lean heavily on what D365 can do out of the box and what some of that standard functionality can provide. So it's really a matter of understanding, where any given process fits into which bucket. And that's how we treat this overall work stream is, looking at the processes differently depending on which ones are the highest priority. Another aspect of this that's important are those last two line items in the table. One being the operational gap analysis and really understanding the gaps between where we are today and where we're headed so that we can address that from a change management perspective, and also just make sure that internally we're all aligned on those decisions and changes that are happening. And then the final thing on this table is making sure that we implement processes and procedures where appropriate, things that we don't necessarily need to wait for us to go live on D365. It could be more procedural changes or just general process changes that we want to start rolling out now in advance of D365. And certainly D365 should be able to further automate and make those processes even more smooth. But there's no reason to wait to roll out all the changes all at once at go live. So usually we find there's somewhere between a third and half of process improvements can and perhaps should be rolled out prior to a go live. And it's a good way to manage change and ease the transition for employees and also get the low hanging fruit of some benefits while you're waiting for the functionality of D365 to be rolled out. Now, this is especially important if you're a global company and you're not going to be, for whatever reason, if you're not going to be in that 12-month range or average implementation duration range that Ash mentioned earlier. If you're going to be a multi-year type of implementation, that's even more reason for you to think about what can we be rolling out now as far as improved processes and procedures. And so this is just an example of how we typically would address business process management and how we move from defining your current state to the future state. And it's typically an iterative process that involves starting with the current state, moving to the future state based on your pain points, looking at your business benefits and metrics, identifying the change impacts, and then ultimately defining the risks. So this whole process, business process and operational readiness work stream becomes a really important input into those future state requirements and the requirements that we want to hold the SI or VAR accountable to. It becomes an input into our overall roadmap, our change management plan, and then whatever interim process improvement plan we might have in place. So on the people readiness side, I'm going to talk a lot about this tomorrow when we get into the organizational change management component. So I won't spend a lot of time here, but suffice to say, there's a lot of prep work that should be done prior to getting too far into your implementation, where we're looking at, what is our change team going to look like, conducting an organizational readiness assessment to understand where the most resistance is going to come from, what the sources of resistance might be, and how we can start to mitigate that and put together a change plan that addresses that assessment or the things identified in the assessment. And then we also get into organizational and role design and any sort of organizational changes that might come about as a result of the D365 rollout. Just to give you an example, if a lot of times companies when they roll out Power BI or general analytics within D365, they find that it automates a lot of people's jobs. And so rather than someone spending 80% of their time gathering data and trying to put together these reports, D365 ends up automating some of that process. So what are we going to do with those people? How are we going to, it's one thing to say they can do more strategic work, but what does that mean if they're going to do more strategic work? What do we expect of them? What is their job going to look like? And how can we start enabling or preparing those people for those changes now, so that when we do have the new technology and things do become automated, we have a clear plan for how to best use our human capital, and there's with the least amount of disruption. Then we get into technical readiness. This is the fourth of the 5 work streams. This is where we look at the overall architecture and integration plan that I mentioned earlier, understanding how exactly are we going to tie D365 to any of the third-party legacy systems, or even within D365, if we have multiple phases, what's our interim integration plan? While we're waiting for those additional modules to roll out in phase 2 or 3 or whatever, what are we going to do in the meantime as far as integration points or manual processes to tie everything together and make sure we don't let things slip through the cracks? So having a clear architecture and integration plan is important. I won't talk about data cleansing and mapping because Daryl's going to talk about that tomorrow much better than I possibly could. So she'll cover that tomorrow. And then IT skills is another area we look at in terms of understanding the gaps between who you have and the skills you have on staff today and what you're going to need tomorrow to support D365. More in the context of a center of excellence that you see on the last line item of the table. We want to think of this in terms of how can we make your internal organization as self-sufficient and sustainable as possible, and also make sure that we have the skill sets in place prior to bringing on the system integrator, so that when the system integrator comes on and your project team is probably outnumbered by consultants from that system integrator, you can stand toe-to-toe with them and be an active partner in the overall implementation, rather than having to defer completely and give up complete control to the system integrator because you don't have the right skill set or the right knowledge. So a lot of you on the phone may not, that may scare you because you think, I don't have the knowledge. That's why we're bringing on the experts. We can never be as good at this as an SI. And we're not suggesting you need to be as good as your SI, but you at least need to have a minimum level of competency around D365 and just transformation best practices in general, so that you can better manage the system integrator, manage the overall transformation, and just be more active in the overall project. And then finally, the final work stream that we talked through was the project governance and planning. And this is where we get the charter in place, we build out the project team and the organization, define what the overall plan is going to be, including but not limited to the project plan of what the system integrator or VAR is going to be doing. Keep in mind that their activities or the things they've proposed to you are just one work stream of many that need to happen. There's a lot of other things outside their scope that are going to need to be addressed, things like data migration, change management, your internal, any of the internal processes that are up to you, user acceptance testing, for example. Oftentimes there's, to Marcus's points earlier, there's usually some fine print in your contracts that suggests that, yeah, we, the vendor or the system integrator, are going to migrate the data for you, for example, but you're responsible for cleaning it, for mapping it to the old to the new system, and you just give us the data and we'll put it in the system for you. So might be one bullet line item under the assumptions of your SOW, but that's a big deal. And so we just need to understand, what is that overall implementation plan to include, but not just include the SI activities, but also your internal and other third-party types of activities. And your risk management and mitigation plan. I should say mitigation, not migration. But making sure you've got a clear risk management and mitigation plan is important. And the whole idea here is, we work with some clients who, bring us in after they've already engaged a system integrator and realized that they need help managing that system integrator. One of the things we find is that the problem was they never even had their team staffed internally by the time they brought in their system integrator. So the SI came in and just kind of took over the entire project. And again, they're outnumbered by the system integrator. And by the time they staffed up their team internally, the SI had already gone too far down the path of making key decisions that weren't necessarily right for the business. So that's the dynamic we're trying to avoid here, making sure that, again, you treat this as more of a program management aspect. Your SI is going to provide project management for their work stream, but you as a client need to be providing the overall program management. for the transformation. Any questions before we go on to the last few slides here?
I just had a question. Do you, specific to D365, is there a list of things that can be expected out of a VAR and an SI, or is it just like any other general software purchase?
In general, it's very consistent or pretty consistent across vendors or across D365, SAP, Oracle, whatever the case may be. But having said that, each VAR and SI has a different contract and different way of operating. And back to Marcus's session before mine today, it really just depends on what is in the proposal and in the contract. More importantly, what's in the contract that would determine that. So, I mean, I can tell you what I think it should be, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's what's in the VAR SI's contract.
And more specifically, does it differ because it is SaaS versus on-premise, or is there some do's and don'ts that we need to be? Do you have anything that is specific to SaaS related implementations around VAR and SIs? That will be useful for us.
As far as activities, or what part of that do you mean? Activities that you or your VAR might?
What you can expect and what you can kind of push down their throat when you're contracting.
Eric, I think I can actually throw something on this. From the great thing with AX or with the D365, they're still using the sure step methodology. So the role for the VAR, from a responsibility standpoint, I mean, down to the weeds in terms of what activity they're actually involved or responsible for, throughout the implementation, there are like defined, specific roles. Like, for example, what is that PM from the VAR responsible for from a configuration standpoint? What does that mean, as a work stream? What responsibilities are there? So from that standpoint, there is, a way to put, Eric, if that's something that would be of value, maybe that's something we can put together.
Yeah, that'd be a good side conversation to have for sure.
Yep.
And some of the other, aspects here, your environment, your staging of the environment, that's going to vary depending on if you're, in a SaaS environment or SaaS or cloud environment versus a on-premise. And then also how data gets loaded, and then security too. So those are some of the things that do vary or should vary in terms of roles and responsibilities for your VAR and SI, and just things that are treated differently based on that.
Yeah, from a contractual standpoint, you want to make sure you've got privacy issues and obligations in the contract. It's very common right now for SaaS contracts to have substantive, it's not necessarily GDPR, but it's just data privacy and security language that really holds their feet to the fire. So, and there's pretty standard language that most software companies will agree to now. This issue, while cutting edge, it's been around for a little bit, and people have kind of figured out what the negotiation points are. So, but regardless, all of that has to be in the statement of work or the contract in substantive detail.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Right. So I'll cover one last quick topic, and since we are up on the top of the hour here, and I'll leave a few minutes for questions if you have any as we wrap up. But when we look at how do we implement QA or quality assurance within our overall deployment? A lot of companies don't think about this because you think, well, I'm going to hire the system integrator or the VAR, and they're going to provide the QA. It's typically not the case. Usually they're kind of heads down designing and building and testing software. They're not necessarily thinking about this typically from a global risk management perspective and identifying risk before they become problems. And that's one of the biggest, I'd say, capability gaps that most SIs and VARs have, especially in the Microsoft space, simply because the Microsoft ecosystem is so fragmented with so many different players that are highly, call it unregulated by Microsoft, that there's a lot of inconsistency in the market, a lot of mom and pop shops that are providing SI and VAR support. And so they don't necessarily think big picture or more strategically around, how do we identify and mitigate the risks of this type of transformation. So QA is really important to help make sure we identify risks before they're too late, that whole canary in the coal mine concept. making sure we've got governance in place early on, really just augmenting SureStep with more of a technology agnostic implementation framework too. SureStep's great for figuring out how are we going to deploy D365, but there's a lot of deficiencies in SureStep in terms of how we're going to manage this overall transformation to address the business and the people and the process side of things. And so I'll let you read through the rest of these, but those are some of the benefits of having a QA framework to help augment what your system integrator is doing to identify those risks and challenges. And this is a role that we, at third stage, will commonly play with our clients as an extension of their project team, of the client's project team, to ensure that we identify those risks and ensure quality and help manage the project and the overall program along the way. And so when we think about quality assurance, this is actually a framework that we use not only for implementations that we're managing, but we also use the same framework for project recovery assessments when we go into a failure and help assess what's going wrong, what are the problems, and what do we need to do to remediate. And then we use the same framework for a third purpose, which is for our expert witness engagements when we're analyzing what went wrong in a failure and just making sure we assess and analyze the project from all the different lenses that are required to look at it from. So I won't go through this in detail, but just want to put this up in front of you to get the wheels turning on asking yourselves the question of, are we addressing all these different things? And it may be that some areas you feel pretty comfortable with, it's going well so far, but you're going to find that there's other areas that, we haven't really even thought about that yet, or we're not sure that our system integrator can handle that, or we've started to do some stuff here, but it's not going well. So it gives you a way or a framework to look at what are all the different things that we can be looking at from a QA perspective, and do those things to ensure alignment and assess and mitigate risk along the way.
Is there any tools or templates around this that stage can recommend or share?
Yeah, we have a template we use to assess in these areas that kind of unpacks each of these bullets in more detail, asking a series of questions and documents that we look at to analyze within these areas. It's not in this PowerPoint presentation though, but we do have that.
Yeah, will you be sharing that with us? Or?
Potentially, if you hire us. I mean, that's one of the proprietary types of things we use to help our clients manage that sort of thing. So that's conceptually we can share the framework, but as far as the details behind it and all the thought process that went into creating that methodology, that's something that we share with our clients and use with our clients. And then the overall approach here is an ongoing circular assessment throughout the project. It never really stops. You're always assessing, defining the risk mitigation plan. You're recasting, refining your implementation plan based on the risks that you identify. And then you're providing that, PMO governance QA support along the way, and you continue that cycle throughout the process. So it's not really a time-based process. It's something that's constantly happening, and each week and month that goes by, you're going to identify new risks. There's new things that come up as the project evolves and as scope evolves, as people's reactions to the project evolve, and as the project becomes more clear. So that's an accelerated view of that presentation and framework. At this point, with the few minutes we have left, I'll see what questions you all have.
In the previous slide, there was a QA/IV and V. Can you just help me understand IV and V, please?
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. I always forget is a acronym that not everyone knows. It's independent verification and validation. And it's actually a term that's not used often in the commercial space, but in the government, public sector space, that's the term that they use. So if you ever work in that space, you'll probably more likely to hear it there than in the commercial space. And QA though, it's no different than QA though. It's the same concept.
Eric, Ash, and Rob, I have to drop. Thank you so much because I got to get another call. Thank you very much. And if there are any other questions, please go.
No problem.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for attending.
Yeah, thank you. We'll see you tomorrow.
Yep.
Okay. Any other questions before we wrap up for the evening here?
Now, will you be sending the link for the trial version today, or shall we expect it at the end of the sessions tomorrow?
Yeah, we'd be toward the end of the week. We'll send you links to the recordings as well as a link to a share file folder that contains the presentations. So you'll have the recordings, you'll have the PowerPoint decks, you'll have all that by the end of the week.
Yeah, but you said that you will share the link for getting the trial, 30-day trial version of F&O.
Oh, sure. Yeah, that was Ash's.
Yes. I've noted and expect a link. I'll pass it to Eric. I'm sure you'll get it.
Thank you very much.
Try to package everything in one email so you guys just get it all
Oh, perfect.
together. You know, all the materials follow up.
And Donna, your reports as well.
Yes, I was about to mention that. Thank you.
No problem. I read your mind.
All right. Well, I want to thank you all for being with us here today on the first day, and look forward to tomorrow morning. And like I said, tomorrow we'll get into data migration, organizational change management, and then just more lessons from failures and what it means to us in our current transformation. So thanks very much for your time, and we'll see you all tomorrow.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.